All right, well, welcome everyone to our evening with Patrick Mason with Colorado Faith Forums. We appreciate all of you being here, and a big thank you to Patrick Mason for spending his Sunday evening with us. We're looking forward to hearing from him. We'll start with an opening prayer from Emily Allred, who's in the Grandview Ward here in Colorado. And then I will just give a little information and introduce our speaker. Hey, Emily.
Our dear Father in heaven, we are grateful for this chance we have to come together, and we're grateful for Patrick and the time he's taken to prepare a message for us tonight. We're grateful for our Savior and for his gospel and for this opportunity we have to gather as believers. And we ask that you'll bless us to have your spirit here and for our faith to be strengthened. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Emily. So I want to just mention we have a few of our Colorado Faith Forums board members here tonight. Mark and I are members, and then Stephanie Dix there, and Taylor Dix is here. Unfortunately, Gail and Doug Berkey and Kathy and James Crapo are not able to join us tonight, and they are so sad to miss it. The Berkeys are doing the global dental relief in Nepal for a month. And the Crapos are traveling this weekend. So I'm sorry they won't be here, but if you're new to our group, if you don't know about us, we're Colorado Faith Forums. We're a nonprofit. We were established in 2016, 17, Steph, is that right? Something like that? 2016. Yeah. And our goal is to promote thoughtful and faithful discussion around issues concerning LDS beliefs and culture and history. And as part of that, we get to bring in wonderful speakers. We also have a website. You can check us out there, and we have a Facebook page you can follow, and an email list if you'd like to stay up to date on our events. Our next event will be April 23rd, and this will be in person at the Crapos home. And our speaker that evening will be Reverend Michael Livingston. He's a Presbyterian minister who recently served as the senior minister at the historic Riverside Church in New York City. And he's worked for years on interfaith engagement, especially with the International Council of Community Churches and the National Council of Churches. And he's also a personal friend of Doug Berkey's. So it'll be interesting to have more of an interfaith perspective at our next discussion. Just FYI, we are recording this event tonight and this discussion, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel if you'd like to go back and watch it later. We will hear from Patrick Mason, and then afterwards we'll have some time for a Q&A. Mark and I will moderate that Q&A session. So if you would like, even as Patrick is talking, if you'd like to send a chat to the Colorado Faith Forums in the chat, or just to the group, Mark and I will keep track of that and help moderate the Q&A. Okay, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Mason is a professor of religious studies and history at Utah State University, where he holds the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture. He is the author or editor of several books, including most recently Restoration, God's Call to the 21st Century World, and also Proclaim Peace, The Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict, which he co-authored with David Pulsipher. He lives in Logan, Utah with his wife, Melissa, and their 4 children. And we are just so honored to have him with us tonight. And I've met Patrick a couple of times at conferences, and I can just say that he is one of the smartest people I've ever met in person. And I just always enjoy hearing what he has to say. And he's an excellent speaker, and he knows a little bit about everything. I feel like, whether it's history or theology or art, he's up for any kind of discussion and has something interesting to contribute. So we're really excited to hear from him. So Patrick.
Thanks, Jenny. That's really kind. Really appreciate that. And it's great to be with all of you. It'd be even more fun to be there in person, but it's nice and easy to just stroll into my home office here right after dinner and, open the computer, and here we are. So I'm going to apologize in advance. This weekend, I've developed a little bit of a nagging cough. It probably didn't help that I was out this afternoon building a snowman with my kids. And so I'm working on cough drops and various liquids and so forth. So I hope to get through here through the next little bit. So I'll share a few thoughts, and I've got some slides to share. And then I'm also just really looking forward to the conversation a little bit later on. So here, let me open my slides here. All right, can you all see that? Okay. So what I want to talk about tonight is our title is the Restoration's third century, and you see this kind of home renovation slide here. This will make maybe even a little bit more sense a little bit later in the presentation. But so as I think, here we are in 2023. 200 years ago, Joseph Smith was visited by the angel Moroni. The next few years is going to be a series of events commemorating 200 years of the Restoration. So this year is Moroni's first visit. Then it'll be, the bringing forth of the plates, and then the translation of the Book of Mormon, and then finally the establishment of the church in 1830. So 2030 will be the 200th anniversary. So as over the past few years, I'm a historian, so I think about these kinds of things. And I was thinking about these anniversaries coming up, and so I as a historian, I like looking backward. That's what I'm trained to do. And so I'm interested in the first 2 centuries of the Restoration, and that's actually no mean feat. Obviously, when you compare the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to other world faiths, to Judaism, to Christianity, to Islam, to Buddhism, right? I mean, we're just a baby. We're an infant compared to those other faiths. But the fact of the matter is that very, very few religions make it to 200 years. There are new religions popping up all the time, but very, very few last even a few years. Almost none outlive their founder. And so the fact that we've made it here to the point that we can talk about what does the third century of the Restoration look like is actually a pretty rare feat in world history. But I do think it's worth, we'll celebrate the past 2 centuries, and appropriately so. We'll celebrate what happened in the 1820s and 1830s, and we should. But as a person of faith, as a person who lives in the 21st century, I'm actually even more interested in what this church and what this religion looks like moving forward, even as interesting as it is looking backward. I want to start. So this is a picture of the Sacred Grove, and we all know what happened there 200 years ago, 203 years ago now, when Joseph Smith walked into that grove, and he was seeking forgiveness of his sins, and he was also looking to know which path to go on spiritually. He was asking a question that lots of people in his generation were asking, namely, which of all the churches is true? Which of all the churches should I join? And that's a question that he was not the only one in the 1820s who had that. That was a question at the top of the mind of probably the majority of Christians in this country. There was so much religious competition. And so they were all asking this question, which church should I join? Which of all the churches is right? Well, just a few years ago, I was invited to give a lecture, actually not too far from the Sacred Grove, at a place called Chautauqua. It's this incredible kind of resort right on this lake in upstate New York. It's been there, for over 100 years, and thousands of people come every summer. It's this idyllic place. It's incredible, and they have a really impressive bit of programming every week during the summer of arts and culture and lectures, and I mean it's just a kind of a smorgasbord of things, music, all kinds of art, all kinds of things. So anyway, so I was invited to speak a few years ago on the rise of Mormonism, and so I went and gave a lecture, and you can see some of the crowd. I mean, it was in this incredible place. They call it the Hall of Philosophy, this outdoor setting that just incredible. And so I had hundreds of people there, a bunch of other people watching online. People were spilled out onto the lawn beyond. It was just this incredible setting. And I talked about the origins of Mormonism. I talked about the rise of the church. I talked about Joseph Smith having this experience where he asked which of all the churches is true. Now keep in mind that these are people, these are for the most part, people who go to Chautauqua are usually affluent, they're usually highly educated. And keep in mind that these are people who are choosing to spend some of their summer vacation to come listen to a lecture about the origins and history of Mormonism, right? So this is, these are people who are already sort of dialed in to religion. They care about religion, they're interested in religion. And of those hundreds of people who were there, at the end of my lecture, I said, just by the show of hands, I'm just curious, how many of you who are here today, how many of you would say that you are animated with the same question that Joseph Smith had 200 years ago? For how many of you is that question, which of all the churches is right? How many of you care about that question? Okay, and again, hundreds of people who were there because they care about religion. They were there on their summer vacation, listening to a lecture about religion. How many of you care about that question, which church is true? And out of those hundreds of people who were there, one hand went up. And I talked to that person afterwards, and it turns out that they were a Latter-day Saint. Okay, so out of all these, so 200 years ago, this question, which church was true, just absolutely riveted America. But we know from all kinds of studies, I mean, this was just anecdotal evidence to me, because we know from all kinds of studies that the question, which church is true, is just not an animating question in the hearts and minds of most Americans anymore. Increasingly, what we find, especially among millennials and Gen Z, they're not asking the question, which church is true or which religion. Instead, they're asking the question, why religion or why church at all? So the conversation has shifted, the questions have shifted. So the culture, of course, has shifted over the past 200 years. So it seems to me that as we think about the future of the restoration, and not just sitting on our laurels, not just sitting on the glories of the pioneers, but actually thinking about what does the restoration have to offer the world in its third century, and recognizing that the questions now are different, maybe it suggests that the answers might be a little bit different as well. So that's why I want to talk about tonight, offer a few thoughts, and then just open it up to conversation. Now, you've all seen charts like this. Don't be scared. We're not going to be doing math. These are all just charts showing what's known as the rise of the nuns, or the rise of disaffiliation, the decline of people associating with religion. Looking at the charts from left to right, and these all come from the Pew Research Center, one of the most, if not the most reputable organizations that does nationwide polling on these kinds of things. And so you can see that over the past 30 years, on the far left, it shows that the number of people who are religiously unaffiliated. So when a pollster calls them up and says, "What religion are you?" they say none of the above. That number has risen by almost 30 million people. And this left off in 2018, 2019. I imagine, well, we know actually that number is much bigger today. That chart is just continuing. And the absolute number of Christians has declined in recent decades. The middle chart shows that as recently as 2007, 2008, the majority of Americans still reported going to church at least once a month. Over the course of only a decade, that flipped almost exactly. So that now the majority, and again, those charts have just continued since over the past 4 or 5 years. So the majority of Americans do not attend church. And then you can just see on the far right one, that the market share, so to speak, of Christianity has declined significantly over the past. Again, this is all recent history. We're not going back to the 1960s. We're going back to 2007 here. So over the past 15 years, to show how dramatically this has declined, and this is not because of a rise of other religions, right? So it's not like Islam is capturing that market share. It's not like Judaism is capturing that market share. No. Basically, everybody who's leaving Christianity is leaving religion altogether. And we could be here all night showing similar kinds of charts like that. And again, I know this is not news to you. This has been well reported, but just to illustrate, again, the world we live in today in 2023 is very different than the world that Joseph Smith and the early members of the church lived in the 1820s and 1830s. And so a lot has changed. And so we have to respond. So I think part of what we have to respond to is what does it mean to be a member of a church, especially a member of a church that makes strong truth claims in the context of a culture that frankly doesn't care very much about truth claims, and in which people are asking about, whether religion is even worth it at all. And over the past several centuries, actually, there's been kind of two major approaches. I mean, everybody knows that there's lots of religions out there. Certainly ever since in Christianity, ever since the Protestant Reformation, right? I mean, the number of churches has multiplied, and then you add all the religions around the world. So people encounter that diversity and they approach that diversity in different ways. Now, one way that people approach it is through a philosophy that we can just call exclusivism. Basically, I'm right and you're wrong. I have the truth, the one and only truth. God's revealed it to me and mine and ours. And I'm sorry, not yours. You're welcome to join us if you'd like, but we have all the truth. So that's of course been a very common thing in all religions. All religions have a kind of exclusivist streak, and it's not just a religion thing too. We see this politically and lots of other ways as well. So exclusivism is, in a lot of ways, this has probably been the dominant mode for most of human history. The idea that I'm right, you're wrong. Over the beginning in the late 19th century, and we can find some earlier antecedents to this, but it really picked up pace in the late 19th and 20th centuries. There became a different view of world religions in particular, and this we can call relativism. And this is basically, there's many paths up the mountain, right? That down at the base camp, things look very different, right? We're all at different places. Judaism looks different than Islam, which looks different than Hinduism, and all these different things. But actually, as this view goes, as you get higher and higher, as you get to the things that matter most, as you ascend the holy mountain, so to speak, when we get to the top, we're all going to be in the same place. There's one God, one truth that unifies us all, and we're all just approaching it from different perspectives. Now, obviously, this has a lot of things to go for it. Jenny talked about a kind of interfaith setting. Certainly, this works well in an interfaith setting to kind of validate other people's expressions. But the problem with relativism is that the vast majority of people don't actually believe that. They actually believe that there's a reason that they are Catholic or Jewish or Hindu or whatever. I mean, of course, most people are born into the religions that they have, but still, people make choices and they choose to be Catholic. They choose to be Latter-day Saint. They choose to be Buddhist, especially in a world where it's clear that there's other options. And so while relativism is actually really useful in terms of, getting along with your neighbors, it actually doesn't speak to the kind of inner core that motivates us as religious believers. And so I think what we need to develop and what philosophers and theologians in lots of religions, this is not unique to anything I'm going to say here for the next little bit. But I think what we have to develop is something that doesn't have the pitfalls of exclusivism, and those pitfalls are obvious, especially in a diverse world, nor the pitfalls of relativism. But is there another way for us to think about, especially for us as Latter-day Saints, to think about our relationship with other people and other faiths around the world? And I think there is. And I think we can call this a theology of pluralism. In my book, Restoration, I call it particularism. But here's the basic idea. And for me, this comes back to our theology of spiritual gifts. And I love this revelation of Joseph Smith, section 46. For all have not every gift given unto them, for there are many gifts. To every person is given a gift by the Spirit of God. Okay, so everybody's got a spiritual gift. Nobody has all the gifts. To some is given one, to some is given another, that they may be profited thereby. All these gifts come from God for the benefit of the children of God. Okay, so these gifts are given from God to every person. This is universal. This is not restricted to members of the church. This is not restricted to people who have made covenants with God. This is not restricted to Israel. This is universal to the entire human family. All people have spiritual gifts. They're all different spiritual gifts. They all come from God, and they're meant to benefit other people. Okay. Now, I think we generally I think we're all good with this doctrine. I think we love this doctrine. And I think we generally apply it to ourselves as individuals, right? I have some gifts. You have some gifts. Our neighbor has some gifts, right? So we understand that on an individual level. But I wonder if we can actually extend it a little bit further to think not just about individuals, but to think about the gifts that God has given to groups, to cultures, to religions, to extend that beyond just the personal or the individual. And I think the reason that it's important for us to do this is because there's so few Latter-day Saints in the world. There actually is a line there. If you look really closely, there is a line that represents the 0.2%, but it's very, very small. Okay, that's us versus the rest of the world. Now, here in Logan, Utah, it can be really easy to forget this, right? I know in Colorado, this probably resonates with you a little bit more. But the fact is that Latter-day Saints are tiny. We're always going to be tiny. The dreams that we had in the 1980s and 1990s of this incredible growth where there were going to be hundreds of millions of Mormons all around the world, those certainly have not proven true. So we're tiny. And I think part of the task of the Restoration's third century is to make sense of that tininess. What does it mean to be tiny? What does it mean to have all this stuff that God has given to us and promised us, and yet we are so tiny? Surely God doesn't just love 0.2% of their children. Surely God's love extends far beyond that to 100% of the human family. So how do we make sense of this when we couple it with the truth claims that we have as Latter-day Saints, the incredible gifts that we have, with the reality of our tininess in the world? Well, I think this goes back to a theology of pluralism. And we have lots of early sources that point us in this direction. I like this quote from Brigham Young, but I could dig up lots of others from Joseph Smith, from the scriptures, etc. But Brigham Young, who of course was not wishy-washy about his faith. Nobody would ever accuse Brigham Young of being a relativist, okay? But here's what Brigham Young says in 1859 to the saints. It is now our duty and calling to gather up every item of truth, whether the infidels, which was the 19th century term for unbelievers, non-Christians, whether the infidels have it, the Universalists, the Church of Rome, Catholics, the Methodists, or the Quakers, or Shakers, or the Presbyterians, or the Baptists, every one of them have more or less truth. And then I love, he doesn't stop there. Yes to the sciences of the day, yes to the philosophy in every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. No matter how many errors they have a great many truths. I love the expansiveness of this vision. I love this sense of like, hey, we just want to gather it up from wherever it comes from. So for whatever religion it comes from, but we're not just going to stop there at religious truth. We're going to bring in science. We're going to bring in philosophy. You could extend that thing about art and culture and every other form of truth, right? And Brigham Young just, it's not that we're doing this just to be nice or to pretend to be polite around our neighbors. He says it is our duty and calling as Latter-day Saints to gather up all this truth. Similarly, 100 years later, in 1978, the First Presidency gave this incredible statement. We always think about 1978 about the revelation on priesthood, which of course was a landmark moment for the church. But earlier that year, you could see that Spirit was working upon President Kimball in that first presidency in terms of God helping them think bigger about God's work than they had previously thought. And so this statement comes from the First Presidency in early 1978, a few months before the priesthood revelation. The great religious leaders of the world, such as Muhammad, Confucius, the Reformers, as well as philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and others, received a portion of God's light. Moral truths were given to them by God to enlighten whole nations, to bring a higher level of understanding. We believe that God has given and will give to all peoples sufficient knowledge to help them on their way to eternal salvation, either in this life or in the life to come. Now, this is the interesting part of it. So in some ways, that first paragraph sounds kind of relativistic, like, oh, well, God gives light to everybody. It's all even playing field. But then in this last paragraph, we also declare that the gospel of Jesus Christ, restored to his church in our day, provides the only way to a mortal life of happiness and a fullness of joy forever. For those who haven't received the gospel, the opportunity will come to them in this life, in the life hereafter, if not in this life. So you've got this really interesting tension, I think a really productive tension in this statement. On the one hand, God sheds his light and knowledge to all the world, to all people, all cultures, all religions. But also there's something distinctive, there's something unique about the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So how do we hold these things together? Okay, so again, this is where I think we can talk about a theology of pluralism or particularism. And the metaphor I like to use for this is a farm. Okay, so the scriptures talk all the time about vineyards and whatnot. So let's let God sort of diversify his holdings and have a big farm, not just be growing grapes. All right, and so imagine an enormous farm in which every possible crop is being grown. Okay, apples and bananas and grapes and cucumbers and grapefruit and kumquats and everything else. Okay, and so just this enormous farm where everything is being grown, all of the good things that God has to give to the world. Okay, now obviously the farm is huge. It has to sustain the entire human family, so it's huge, it's enormous. It's way too big for any one small group of people to farm, especially if it's, say, 0.2% of the human population. Okay, so it seems to me that maybe what God does is he says, hey, you over there, you guys grow the apples. You're in charge of the apples, and grow the very best apples you can. Hey, you over there, you guys are in charge of the bananas. Hey, you over there, you guys are in charge of the broccoli, right? And he divvies out the work to everybody so that everybody has a job, everybody has a gift. Because some people are better at growing apples than they are at growing broccoli. Some people, everybody has different passions, everybody has different things that they're good at. And I think we see this as I look around the world religions, and I think about my friends who are from other religions, who are just excellent at certain aspects of apprehending God's character. I think about my evangelical friends and the way that they are excellent in terms of understanding God's grace. I think about my Muslim friends, and I think about their commitment to prayer, to a daily life of prayer 5 times a day, the way that informs every part of their daily rhythms. And we could go on down the line about the things that we see in other religions that are so impressive. Okay, and it seems to me that what God has done is he's apportioned out his goodness, his light, his truth to all of these different peoples, all of these different cultures, all of these different religions. And he said, you cultivate this set of gifts. You're in charge of the apple. And here's the thing, you have to grow the best apples possible because you're in charge of those apples, and you need to share them with the world. If you don't do it, there aren't going to be any apples for anybody to have. All right. You have a job. You can eat the apples, enjoy those apples as much as you want, but you have a job to grow, to cultivate, to nurture those apples, and then to share them with the world. Remember, spiritual gifts are always meant for the benefit of others. Okay. And so if this is true, so I've learned about grace from evangelicals. I've learned about prayer from Muslims, and so on down the line. And so if this is true for others, and we can see the other parts of the farm that other people are on, again, what about the Latter-day Saints? What do we bring? What are the crops that we've been asked to grow, to cultivate distinctively? Obviously, we can share from all those other things. The evangelicals don't have a corner on grace. Muslims don't have a corner on prayer. Okay, but what are some things that we can distinctively offer ourselves? Well, it seems to me we've got a few crops that God has given us, even 0.2% of us, to share with the world. Restoration Scripture. If we don't cultivate and nurture and share the Book of Mormon with the entire world, who else will? Nobody. We know it's good fruit. We know it's delicious to the taste. We want everybody to taste it. And so it is our job to share that with the world. The Book of Moses, Moses 7, are you kidding me, right? The city of Enoch and weeping God, right? If we don't share that with the world, who will? This notion that God continues to speak to modern prophets and apostles, that we have authority given to us to perform these ordinances. The new and everlasting covenant, especially the idea that families can be sealed together forever. our idea of the plan of salvation, especially a notion of premortality, that we are each literally children of God who lived with God before we came here. These are all distinctives and good and delicious crops that God has given us to cultivate. And so we have a responsibility to do that and then to share it with the world. And then the great thing is we get to take from their fruits too, right? Again, we don't have the only crops, but these are the crops that we've been uniquely asked to cultivate, to grow, and then to share. And then we get to feast at the table along with everybody else. And President Oaks said something very similar to this. This is a year or two ago. I've lost track of time now. But he was doing a training with missionaries, and he talked about this. And he specifically referred to this phrase that appears once in Scripture: the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth. And now that's caused a lot of people questions. How can we accept other people's truth, or how can God be sharing other truths with other people if we're the only true and living church? And I love what President Oaks said. He said, sometimes we do a bad job with that scripture, actually. Sometimes we refer to it or interpret that in a way that can give offense to other people, that where we can come across as arrogant, holier than thou, that we can seem like we have a monopoly on truth, that we're better than others. And President Oaks says, no way. We should try to avoid all of those ideas because none of them is true. He said, God has not taught us anything that should cause us to feel arrogant or superior to other people. We're just working our part of the farm. God has called other people to their parts of the farm. And so, while we've got incredible apples to share with the rest of the world, that doesn't make us any better than them, because the fruits of their harvest are so essential to what God has to share for all of us. Okay. Now, okay, so we have this sense of the distinctive crops, the distinctive gifts that God has given us. But in a lot of ways, that's kind of like, okay, that's what the last 2 centuries have looked like. I mean, this incredible deposit of faith that God has given us over the past 200 years to get us to the point now where the church is all around the world. It's been enormously successful, obviously financially. That's what it's in the news a lot. Some people say too successful, right? But just again, only a handful of churches have ever accomplished what the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has in terms of longevity, spread, worldwide spread, and so forth. And so again, that's incredible. That's an incredible story. But where do we go from here? Again, that's this. I don't live in pioneer days. Like, good for them, fantastic, right? But I'm here in the 21st century. What is God calling me to do? What is God calling us to do together? And there was this sense earlier in the church too. Some people thought, like, okay, Joseph Smith dies, like we've got what we need, right? We've got the Book of Mormon, we've got the Doctrine and Covenants, we've got the temple, right? What more do we need? But here are the 12 apostles who say, just almost immediately after Joseph Smith is killed, they send a proclamation to the world. It's actually a pretty audacious document, but they send this proclamation to the world, and they say, still the work has, as it were, but just begun. Right? They say, just because Joseph Smith died, it's like, this thing isn't over. We've just begun. And what is the work that they say has just begun? They say the work is to renovate the world, to enlighten the nations, to cover the earth with light, knowledge, truth, union, peace, and love. That's it. That's our job, just to renovate the entire world, right? To enlighten the nations, to cover the earth with light, knowledge, truth, peace, love. Right? That's our job. Little 0.2% of us. Pretty audacious, pretty daunting. Elder Holland, a couple years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic, gave us a similar kind of vision. He said, when we've conquered the pandemic, and we will, may we be equally committed to freeing the world from the virus of hunger, freeing neighborhoods and nations from the virus of poverty. May we hope for schools where children are taught, not terrified they'll be shot, and for the gift of personal dignity for every child of God, unmarred by any form of racial, ethnic, or religious prejudice. That's our work. That's what it looks like to be part of the restoration. This is the work that has just begun. So, when we talk about the restoration, we can list a lot of things that God has restored to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We can talk about the restoration of the church, the restoration of the priesthood, the restoration of certain doctrines, the restoration of the temple, the restoration of covenants, right? We could make a list. But as I was thinking about this and reading in the scriptures, it really impressed me. These couple of verses, and there are other examples, similar kinds of examples, where God says, and I love this one at the beginning of section 84. Now, at section 84 of the Doctrine and Covenants is a great revelation on priesthood and ordinances and all kinds of things. But it says that this is the word of the Lord concerning his church, established in the last days for the restoration of his people. Again, Nephi, when he looked forward, when he saw in the future, when he prophesied about our day, he said that the Lord God will commence his work among all nations, kindred, tongues, and people to bring about the restoration of his people upon the earth. He didn't talk about the restoration of the church. He didn't talk about the restoration of the priesthood. He didn't talk about the restoration of covenants or the temple. What did Nephi look forward to? The restoration of God's people. So it seems to me that maybe now all of those other things are important, the restoration of the church and the covenants and the temple and all that. But you know what? God isn't all that interested in things. All of those things are given for the benefit of God's people. Those things all exist in the service of the restoration of God's people to wholeness. That is what the restoration is all about. And I think that's the vision that we can bring to its third century. In some ways, this is just going back to the future, or going back to the original to the original deposit, the original grounds of Christianity to begin with. And this was the very first message that Jesus gave when he announced his public ministry. And you remember this, we just read this a couple weeks ago in Sunday school for Come Follow Me. When Jesus, after his baptism and so forth, he went to the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth, and he stood up there in the synagogue and he opened the scroll. Now think about it, there are literally hundreds of prophecies of the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus could have opened the scrolls to virtually any place in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, and found a messianic prophecy that he could have used to refer to himself and say, okay, here I am. But he chose this one. And I think it's so telling that of all of the hundreds of messianic prophecies, this is the prophecy that Jesus chose to say, this is my mission. And he read in that synagogue, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. And when you think about the next 3 years, so that's the beginning of Jesus's ministry. This is where basically he announces, he says, this is my mission statement. And we know from the next 3 years, we know how the story plays out. And Jesus fulfills this mission statement perfectly. He did it for those 3 years, and he's done it for the next 2,000 years, and he's done it infinitely and eternally. Think about what he did just during his mortal ministry. Of course, he went to those who were poor in spirit and preached the gospel to them, but he also went to those who were actually poor, those who were destitute, those who didn't know where their next meal was going to come from, those who were in the depths of poverty, because Jesus is the Messiah of the poor. And yes, he went to those who were spiritually brokenhearted, those who had a broken heart and a contrite spirit, and he healed them. But he also went to those who were just plain brokenhearted, who had broken hearts because of all of the things that life brings, because of death of loved ones, or because of sickness, or because of illness, or because of bad marriages, or because of divorce, or because of financial setbacks, or global pandemics, or any number of things that break our hearts, because Jesus is the Messiah of the brokenhearted. And yes, he went to those who were spiritually captive and tried to redeem them and liberate them from their spiritual captivity. But he also goes to those who are captive in so many other ways, who are in captivity to sin, but also in captivity to addiction, to bad relationships, maybe in actual captivity. Remember, he talked about blessed are, the people who will go and visit people in prison. It would be like visiting him, because Jesus is the Messiah of the captive, of those who were in bondage. And yes, he went to those who were spiritually blind and he took the scales off of their eyes, but Jesus went to the people who were actually blind and actually deaf and actually halt and actually lame and actually leprous and actually diseased and actually those suffering from mental illness of all different kinds, because Jesus is the Messiah of the sick and the disabled. And of course, we're all bruised in a million different ways just from walking on this earth. And so if Jesus is the Messiah of the poor, and if Jesus is the Messiah of the brokenhearted, and the Messiah of the captive, and the Messiah of the blind and the disabled, and the Messiah of the bruised, and if we in the restored church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if we say and claim to be the church of Jesus Christ, the people of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus Christ, then his mission becomes our mission. And so what we do in the restoration is nothing more or less than to restore his mission to the world, to restore that we will bring about in the 21st century the mission that he did in the first century, 2,000 years ago. So our calling is to the poor and to the brokenhearted and to the captive and to the blind and the bruised. And that's what it means to be part of the restoration in its third century. Now, again, we're tiny, right? 0.2%. The world is big, it's daunting, it's overwhelming. There aren't enough of us. There's too many needs. There's so much suffering, right? What can we do? What can we do about Ukraine? What can we do about global poverty? What can we do about the climate crisis, right? There's so few of us. Well, keep in mind how Jesus described his followers 2,000 years ago. They were tiny too back then. And the three main metaphors that Jesus used to describe his followers were salt, light, and yeast. You're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world, you're the yeast or the leaven, right? Now, what do these three metaphors all have in common? They're all tiny relative to the influence that they have, right? You think about salt, right? It's just a pinch of salt goes into any ingredient, right? And what does it do? It transforms it, it elevates it, it brings out the natural flavor in that thing, but it's only a pinch of salt that's necessary to do that. You think about light particles on their own, they're tiny. They're so tiny, they're invisible to the naked eye. But when they come into a dark room, they literally transform it. They transform it. They overpower the darkness and turn it into light. And think about yeast, right? It's one of the least ingredients by volume in a loaf of bread. I don't know, maybe around 0.2% of volume in a loaf of bread. Well, what does yeast do on its own? Not very much. I don't want to eat a spoonful of yeast. It only makes a difference when it interacts with the ingredients around it. It only interacts when it's kneaded into the loaf. And so yeast has an elevating effect, but it has to be in interaction with the rest of the loaf. So it seems to me that that's the calling of the Restoration's third century, is to do exactly what Jesus called his disciples to do 20 centuries ago, was to be the salt, to be the light, to be the yeast that would elevate, that would transform, that would change the world around them. And it would do it in partnership with others. It would not be on their own. I don't want to eat a spoonful of salt. I don't want to eat a spoonful of yeast, right? These things only work in partnership with others, but they have an elevating and a transformative effect. And that's what Jesus calls us to do in the service of the captive, the blind, the bruised, the brokenhearted, the captive, because his mission is our mission. So I'll stop there, and we can just talk about whatever you all want to talk about. Thanks for your patience.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Patrick. Really awesome. So,
and my voice held out. That was the real miracle. So, yeah.
So we have lots of time for questions. So feel free to put a question in the chat, either directly to us or to the group, and we can read your question. You can be anonymous if you want to, and we can read it that way, or you can just raise your hand and jump in and ask a question.
And I should say, I'm happy to talk about anything. So it could be about obviously what I talked about tonight, but if you want to talk about other stuff too, I'm always happy to talk about Notre Dame football. I mean, the really important things in life.
Okay, we've got a question from Karen. In your book, Planted, you mentioned that one of the most common concerns regarding faith crisis was the sense of betrayal. We're wondering what trends you've noticed since then.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that's the thing is that, so that book, Planted, came out at the end of 2015. That seems like ancient history now. I mean, it's amazing how fast the world moves. That was less than 8 years ago, but it still seems like so much has changed. I think those dynamics that I talked about still exist, to be sure. But one of the things that I don't talk about very much in the book, hardly at all, actually, because it was there, but only just building steam. And actually, 2015 was something of a pivot year for it, were concerns around LGBTQ equality and inclusion, both more broadly within the culture, but then especially within the church. So that introduces a whole different set of questions and dynamics and so forth than we have around the more strictly historical questions, which is mostly what I was taking up in that book, and which for the previous decade or so, from the early 2000s up until the mid 2010s, it was the historical and doctrinal issues that really dominated. And I think really around 2015, we saw a shift to being a little bit more of these social and cultural issues that, especially for younger members, millennials and Gen Z, seem to be issues. Now, some of the same dynamics still play out, a sense of betrayal or a sense of, again, like I began my presentation with, now increasingly the question is not which church is true, but why church at all, and which church is good. And so that increasingly becomes the question for a lot of people, is they're just that they have questions around inclusion and whether this is a community for everybody or not. So yeah, some of those things have certainly evolved since 2015.
Thanks. We've got Clint has his hand raised, so I'm guessing Clint has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go right ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm actually an atheist who is an active participating member of the church, and kind of speaking to your just previous answer here, I've really struggled to try to feel fully belonging in the church, obviously as an atheist, and I've felt a lot of, I guess, pull to be included in the nuns and just kind of go that route. Do you see a path forward in the church as an atheist, or someone like me who, primarily for like scientific reasons, who I just struggle to feel confident that there's a God, but love the community, love the so much that the church has to offer that's beautiful, but just struggle to feel belonging there?
Yeah. No, thanks, Clint. Thanks for that question. And I'm really glad you're part of the community. Thank you. I've no doubt that, obviously I don't know you, but I have no doubt that your presence enriches the community, the ward that you attend. And yeah, I think we have to, within, I firmly believe that we can and should make the church a place that is welcoming for anyone who wants to worship with us. Now, not everybody's going to want to worship with us, right? That's fine. People are going to be happy in their other religions or no religion at all. But if people, for whatever reason, are inclined to come be with us on Sundays and during the week and in activities and so forth, then I think we have to make space for them. Now, I do think, it is the Church of Jesus Christ. It's not just the Church of Latter-day Saints. So it's not just a community. We do. I think the claims that we make about Christ's redemption in the world and about God's love and the reality of God. I think those are central. So there might be some limits to what that participation can look like in a community that's predicated around some of those truth claims. But I think those limits, I would think those limits should be pretty limited. And actually what you just expressed in terms of saying, I'm not fully confident, or I'm not sure how far I can go with this, to me, that sounds like the grounds of faith. It actually sounds like a kind of openness to questions and to what might still be revealed. So to me, that sounds like a pretty honest and authentic engagement with the world and with the universe. So I would like to think that we can create spaces in our congregations. Now, again, are the temple recommended questions going to change anytime soon? Probably not. And again, it's a community that is centered around our faith in God and Jesus. But for people who want to be among us and are people who are willing to respect the faith that other people have developed, even while they can't share the faith in some of those core truth claims, but want to be part of the community, I'd say absolutely. So welcome, brother. I'm glad you're with us.
I know Jody has her hand up, but we've got a few questions in the chat. I want to get to a couple first, and then we'll get to you, Jody. Mark Green asks, you talk about enchantment in a secular world. How can members of the church become more enchanted?
Yeah, and here, so enchantment, it sounds like magic, right? I mean, here it's actually, I'm using a sociological term from Max Weber, who was a German scholar at the beginning of the 20th century, who's kind of the founder of sociology. And the idea here is simply that to believe that we live in an enchanted world is to believe in a world that's full of spirits and supernatural presences, and gods and angels and things that we can't fully explain, things that we can't fully reduce or study in a lab. Now, again, with full respect to the scientific method and so forth, but I think there's a sense among many humans, probably most humans, that there are some aspects of the human experience that seem to transcend the purely materialistic or the purely naturalistic, or even scientific, and that's a world I want to live in. I want to live in a world where there can be gold plates. I want to live in a world where God can visit a 14-year-old boy. I want to live in a world where there are forces and realities beyond what I can apprehend with my own rational mind. I want to live in a world of art and beauty and all those kinds of things that are not irrational, but maybe non-rational or supra-rational. So that's what I mean when I talk about enchantment. I think as Latter-day Saints, we should be, I know in certain places and certain circles, to confess a belief in gods and angels and spirits and revelation can make you sound kind of backward or hokey, or like you haven't fully gotten on the Enlightenment train. Well, so be it. Again, fully embracing all of the goods that have come to us through all those other rationalist ways of knowing. I want to live in a world of gods and spirits, as well as a world of rationality and science.
Okay, Jody, go for it, and then I'll turn back to some of the questions in the chat.
Thank you. You mentioned this sense of betrayal being a big factor in faith crises, and it was interesting. The day that I got an advance copy of Planted back in 2016 was also a day a week when I was experiencing severe betrayal. And it wasn't the first time, but what happened is it shaped another step on my faith journey, another step of owning it more completely and being more personally connected directly with God. I'm seeing an awful lot of members kind of taking that on in ways that they maybe didn't see before. When you talk about this place that the church has, the LDS Church and LDS people have in creating something in the world, do you see a way where there is almost not just an acceptance, but almost a celebration of faith journeys that take you through the betrayal to a more powerful place of truly being a presence in the world of those qualities that you talked about that are so unique and compelling and core, even in the face of all the nonsense that's driving a lot of people away. But those who go through those shifts and go through those moments, do you see a path for us to go through that kind of refining or that development, embrace it, not worry about being comfortable with it, and carry that through to impact the world, but in a type of one aspect of community?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Jody, and good to see you. I certainly hope so. I hope that we can, and we haven't been particularly good at this. So over the first 2 centuries of the Restoration, and I think I think most communities, excuse me, I think a lot of communities struggle with this, but we certainly have. And a lot of it comes, I think, from our relative youth. A lot of it comes from a kind of circle the wagons mentality that we've had. A lot of it comes from, I think it's one of the unintended consequences of what I think is one of our really positive and incredible gifts, is this sense of personal revelation. And the number of people, today was Fast and Testimony meeting, right? The number of people who can stand at the pulpit and say authentically, I know X, Y, and Z. I know God lives. I know the Book of Mormon is true. And there's a certain formula there, but for a lot of people, that's real. They've achieved that kind of spiritual knowledge, or achievement probably is the wrong. It's a grace. It's a gift from God. And but because that language is so fully taken over, it means it's crowded out other kinds of faith, other kinds of desire, other kinds of spiritual journeys, to actually, to the point that we've marginalized people who are on those journeys, and those journeys have become almost unrecognizable and sometimes unpracticable within our community. And I think that's impoverished our community, and it's led to some people feeling like they can't be among us when I think we could have done a better job of making room for them. So yeah, one of my hopes moving forward is, again, that we create a place where people bring their many gifts to the table and within the church, and that if people want to worship among us, whatever their journey has looked like, whatever stage in their journey they're at, that they'll find a place at the table with us. They'll find a place of fellowship. But we're not there yet as a people. I think there was a lot of great individuals and maybe groups like this and others who can provide those kinds of spaces for people. A lot of people don't feel those spaces within their local wards. But hopefully over time, we simply get better at that and recognizing the diversity of God's gift among his people.
Patrick, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here that we have through the chat that seem both of them related to sort of the concept of exclusivism. So Terry Lloyd says, thank you for the excellent presentation. While we do not claim to have a monopoly on truth, we do claim to have the exclusive authority for baptism and other saving ordinances. How do we balance these two? And then Reed Allred asks, those outside the church sometimes view the church as elitist or exclusive. You've addressed some of that, but even within the church, there's some feeling of exclusiveness with regard to the doctrine of exaltation in the celestial kingdom. How do we avoid people feeling like there are classes of saints within the church now and in the hereafter? For example, unmarried individuals, LGBTQ plus individuals, and others that might be on the margins of what we typically consider mainstream in the church.
Yeah, terrific. Great questions. So first on the question of ordinances, on the question of priesthood, I think there's absolutely a way, it's so curious to me that we so often adopt the language and even the ideology of exclusivism around the notion of priesthood and of ordinances, because our theology is exactly the opposite. Who gets baptism? Everybody. Who gets the ordinances? Literally everybody. They are literally the least exclusive thing that we offer to the world, right? it's an incredible theology. It's incredible practice that we have, and so priesthood is again because we're human beings, we oftentimes misunderstand or things, but priesthood is not about elevation. It's about service. It's about being in service of other people, and so all that God has called us to do in terms of giving us these ordinances and giving us authority to perform these ordinances is to be in service of the entire world. So literally every child of God is going to get these ordinances. They're the least exclusive thing out there because we offer it and we perform it and we do that service for everybody. So when we think otherwise, we're misunderstanding the universality of God's grace. And that speaks to the second question as well, is that this is I'm a universalist because I'm a Latter-day Saint. I mean, we know one of the striking features of the restoration is the idea that God will save virtually all of their children. Our heavenly parents, we're already saved. I mean, every person you ever encounter is already saved. It's already done. The work is done. And so it simply becomes a question of what the nature and character of that salvation is, and that's going to be entirely up to individuals as to what they want the character of their salvation to look like. I tend to be, there's a debate within Mormon theology about how eternal is eternal progression and all those kinds of things. I tend to fall on the side of, when the scriptures talk about Jesus's atonement being infinite and eternal, I tend to believe that. And so how can we think and speak and embrace people inclusively? It's because we believe in a Savior who wrought an infinite and eternal atonement. And at least the way that I understand those words, they are words without limit. It's love without limit. It's salvation without limit. And so I believe in an infinite and eternal atonement, and that's where I place my faith.
Let me grab a related question from the chat, and then I'll get to Paul Archer, who has his hand up. Jeff Greavy asks, the church is struggling with the LGBT community and an us versus them mentality. Do you see any movement of the church in this area to be more inclusive?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been a ton of movement just over the last 20, 25 years. I mean, so I'm 46 years old. I think about where the church was, where I was. I grew up in the suburbs of Salt Lake, and I think about the culture that I grew up in, the jokes that I made, the taunting, the bullying, and that was in the 1980s and 1990s. And also look at some of the church's publications from not too far before that, and then look at where the church is at now. It's incredible. It's an incredible transformation. It's an incredible, I think, an acceptance of God's ongoing revelation about this segment of God's children. Now, there's still, right? I don't think here in 2023 we've heard the last word from God on that. Now, I don't know what the last word looks like because I believe in ongoing revelation. But certainly the pain points are there, that the tension is there in such a way that I think I don't personally believe that we've landed on our final answer on those questions. So, but again, I recognize the pain, the struggle, the heartbreak that individuals and families are going through right now. But I also compare that to where the church was 20, 30 years ago. And I'm just grateful for the revelation that we've received in the church to put us in a different place regarding this important segment of God's children. And we'll just await further light and knowledge. And I think, we await revelation on a church-wide level, but a lot of individuals are getting revelation too. And so we know that God reveals things both to individuals and to the church, not always at the same time. And so we'll just see what God has in store for us there.
Hey, Paul Archer, go for it.
Hello, Patrick.
Long time no see.
Long time no see. So my question's about testimonies and testimony bearing. We've all heard hundreds of testimonies with the phrase, you had it in your presentation, the only true and living church on the face of the whole earth, which to probably most of us means we not only have the only farm, but we have all the crops. What would you like to hear in testimony meetings? And then I have another testimony question. We've been, I'd say beyond taught, we've been instructed that when we bear testimony, we should have a testimony that follows a prescription, the Book of Mormon, the Restoration, Joseph Smith, Jesus Christ, and outside of that, it's not a testimony. And so we've discouraged the expression of people who might not be at that point. So I heard Clint and I thought, I would love to hear Clint bear a testimony and say, I love to be here because I love the community and I love the way I feel when I'm here and I love all of you and so on, but that's outside of the prescription. So what direction would you like to see coming regarding testimony bearing?
Yeah, I'm not so confident in the prescription. I mean, I know there's been some prescription along those lines. I don't think it's a universal prescription that stands the test of time. I read a lot of testimonies from 19th century pioneer saints, and they don't follow that formula. And those people were awfully faithful. And so, yeah, I understand the prescription that is given by a small handful of leaders, frankly, and I understand the intention behind that. I understand the discouragement of some of what we hear and that passes off as testimonies, the travel logs and all those kinds of things. But actually a travel log can be a pretty powerful means of testifying of God's work in the world. So I just, again, without, I think certain people think of testimony in certain ways. But as I look at the broad swath of both scripture and history, I see and hear a chorus of testimonies, and the formula that we can all recite, that's a very powerful one, right? I mean, that's a soloist that we've heard over and over and over again, and that is good music. But there's a choir behind that soloist that is offering other kinds of voices and other kinds of notes, and I think all of that redounds to testimony as well.
How about the only true and living church? What can we do to understand the power of the church without the notion that we're alone?
Yeah, well, I think President Oaks's instruction is really good. So let's start by being a little more humble. So I think all of everything he said of what that phrase does not mean is absolutely where we should start. So it doesn't mean we're any better than anybody. It does not mean we have a monopoly on truth. It does not mean, that God loves us more than other people. So let's just start with that, right? I think after that, then we can have some really productive conversations about what it does mean. Is it just referring to the authority to perform certain ordinances, again, that are offered to everybody? What does it mean? What does that language mean actually in the 1830s? There's been some really interesting recent research that shows how almost the exact time that revelation came through, Joseph Smith wrote a letter to Emma. He was traveling and he signed it off by saying, "Your only true and living friend." Now, Emma obviously had other friends, and Joseph knew that. So is that, revelation is always couched in language. It's always couched in culture. This is part of the incarnation of Jesus and of the word into the world. So is something going on in that phrase that maybe is not in the 1830s, that maybe is not exactly the way we read it in the 2020s? Maybe not, right? So anyway, I think there's some interesting conversations we have, but let's just start with President Oaks of getting rid of all the misconceptions of what that phrase means.
Thank you.
Patrick, let me ask the other question in the chat, and then I'll take a host's prerogative and ask my own question too. But Jim and Roxy Beardall ask, do you believe Elder Oaks' comments acknowledging the value to be found in other places besides our faith is correlated to the significant departure of people, young people?
Interesting. So, I don't know if the questioner wants to follow up. So is, and I forgot the name of it, whether it's a he or she. Is
Yeah,
suggest-
Jim and Roxy, and feel free to chime in, Jim and Roxy, if you guys are on.
Yeah, if you don't mind chiming in with, tell me more what you're thinking there with that question. Or maybe you're not in a place where you can talk. That's okay.
Now you can.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I grew up in Salt Lake also, downtown. And we didn't ever hear that kind of thing in my young life. That other people have something to offer, other religions have something. There's virtue and goodness and Christ-like attributes to be found everywhere you look, if you're looking. All we ever heard was the other side, the narrower angle that you've made reference to in your comments here today. I'm just wondering if our exclusiveness is making us more common and like everybody else. Are comments like the comments from Brigham, the quote from Brigham Young, or the comments from Elder Oaks, is that potentially opening a floodgate for young people to say, gee, maybe we're not so special. Everybody else is special too. I'm just wondering the impact, because the atmosphere has changed just in the last 10 or 20 years. And I'm just wondering if that is giving people members an invitation to say, gee, I thought we were special, and now I'm finding out we just really believe if things everybody else does. Right. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. No, I really like that question. I think that puts your finger on something, and I think there's something to that. And I'm gonna draw this, refer to a different case first. And so we know this in terms of mainline Protestants in the 20th century. So mainline Protestants are the kind of respectable Protestant denominations, the Episcopalians, the kind of upscale Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans and people who kind of were the kind of center and the majority of Protestants and where the kind of power and money was in the 20th century. Well, their theology, and I'm going to oversimplify here, but their theology and this sort of got to the point where it was so affirming of the culture, especially of a kind of 20th century liberalism, with a focus on freedom and equality and civil rights and all these kinds of things that I think we all see are good things, right? But many of those churches put their eggs in that basket to the point that, and there's a lot of research on this, so I'm not just casting aspersions. This is very well documented by lots of different historians, that the children and grandchildren who grew up in those churches looked around and said, wait a minute, what I hear at church is the exact same thing as I hear in the culture. There's no difference. So why do I need to go to church? Right? All of those kinds of things that are just affirming everything I hear in the culture. Turns out I don't need to be Presbyterian at all, or I don't need to be Episcopalian at all. I can just go on my own way. And those churches have been in free fall numerically and membership wise since the 1960s. There's a lot to be said there, but I think it speaks to your question of, is there a point at which the distinctiveness becomes a strength of saying, hey, we are saying something different than what you can hear anywhere else, and we are saying that there's something special about what's going on here. And that's part of what I wanted to do with this analogy of the farm. And no metaphor is perfect. I mean, we can pick it apart. I could easily pick it apart. But what I'm trying to get at there is it's not relativism. So I think if we slide into a mode of just saying like, oh, everybody has truth, it's all good, go anywhere. And if we stop there, that is a kind of relativistic mode. And so then one path up the mountain is no different or no better than any of the others. What I'm trying to get at in this metaphor is to say, no, well, it is true that there are good things on all these different paths or in all these different parts of the farm, but God has called you to this part of the farm, if you feel so called, right? to this part of the farm, the work that you're doing really matters. It's not just a kind of flat, doesn't really matter, you can get it the same anywhere else, right? Latter-day Saints have to do what Latter-day Saints have been called to do. Because again, the Book of Mormon is special. The Book of Mormon is true. The doctrine of eternal families is special, and that is true. And so if you felt called to that, if God has gifted you with a kind of testimony of those kinds of things, then he's called you to this part of the farm, to work it, to nourish it, to cultivate it. And so then my work on this part of the farm, it's not fear-based. And I think that's a lot of what we developed over the first 2 centuries of the Restoration, is this fear of ever looking at any other part of the farm. And what that led to was a kind of hostility towards the members and the workers on other parts of the farm, which are our sisters and brothers. And again, that's what President Oaks was saying. No, we cannot do that, that God loves them just as much as he loves us. But God has given us certain things that we are called to, that we have to share with the world. And that is essential work that we have to do. So it's a little more complex. It's a little more, a fear-based dualism, exclusivism. That's an easy message to sell. But I also think that's a message that undercuts God's love for all of their children. So I get the fear of what happens when we transform the message, but I just think that our message has to be a positive one, not a negative one. It has to be a love-based message, not a fear-based message. And I have confidence that that'll capture the hearts and minds of our own members.
Okay, I know.
That's a good answer.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. That's a good answer, and I really appreciate your fervent testimony. Bless your heart. You're a good rep there, by golly.
Thanks. Thank you.
Breitbart said that politics runs downstream from culture, and what I'm observing is that our religion is somewhat downstream from the changing culture that we're engaged in, and that could be documented by a few of the revelations in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that makes us seem a little less exclusive every time something like that pops up. But anyway, that's my response to your testimony, and really think it's you're doing a good work.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, thank you. So I know Mark said he was going to take host prerogative and ask a question, but I'm taking spouse prerogative and jumping ahead of him. And Patrick, you spoke a little bit about spiritual gifts to individuals, but also spiritual gifts to groups. I just wondered if you could expound a little more on maybe this sort of community versus individual action, especially in terms of living true religion and renovating the world, as you talked about, and what can we do as individuals, and how is that different from what we can do as groups in our ward, or and even in larger groups as the whole church? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a terrific question, Jenny, and I think I think the answer is embedded in the question, in that that there are certain kinds of actions that are going to be better done at different levels of scale, and there's certain kinds of ministry, there's certain kinds of transformation that can only happen at the individual level. It can only happen at the one-on-one level, and this is why we're so touched by Jesus's individual ministry to people. It's incredible, but we also, and I don't mean to offend anybody here, but we don't live in a libertarian universe. We don't live in a world of isolated individuals. That actually at the core of our theology as Latter-day Saints is that we only exist in relationship with one another. We've always existed in relationship with one another. And so we exist, it's always been a both and. I am me, but I'm only me because I'm part of we. Because I'm part of a broader set of relationships with God, with family, Of course, we come into this world in relationship with our mothers. And so this is the great tension. And so yes, so much of the ministry and so much has to be done at the individual level, but there are certain kinds of things that can only be done in relationship. So sometimes at the family level, sometimes at the community level, sometimes at the ward level, sometimes at the national level, sometimes at the global level. I can't tackle the climate crisis on an individual level, but just by myself. Now I can make individual decisions, but there are going to be things that we have to do as a global community to address global problems. We know this in our wards too. There's a lot of ministering that can be done one-on-one, but there's a reason we build youth programs, right? There's a kind of sociality, there's a kind of community where transformative things happen precisely in those kinds of relationships. So I think we just have to we just have to be wise. We have to be discerning. In the Roman Catholic Church, they have a principle called subsidiarity. It's part of Catholic social teaching, and they say that issues should be taken care of at the kind of lowest possible level. So if something can be taken care of at the individual level, then do it that way. But there's a recognition that some things have to be done at the family level. And sometimes some issues have to be done at the parish level or the congregation level. Some things have to be done at the national level. So part of it is just being wise and discerning about what is the issue and what is the level of action that it requires. And so then that's where I'm going to put my efforts into. So I know that's kind of a general and vague answer, but I really like that principle of subsidiarity of kind of seeking the discernment of, okay, where is the proper level for this action, recognizing that it might be different on a different level.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm glad Jenny went first, because my question actually works really well as a follow-up to that. When we talk about the salt or yeast or light of the world, we sort of have this notion of going out and doing good things in the world outside of the walls of our church, right? We tend to, at the, speaking of sort of the different levels where we might take action, at the ward level, we tend to be very focused within the boundaries of our church, right? We tend to be focused on members of the ward and their families. And every, ward congregation tends to have, in terms of people, dealing with the various hierarchy of needs, some people that they're just struggling to meet their own needs and don't really have much capacity to go out and minister outside those needs. And then the people in our wards that maybe do have that capacity, we tend to load them up with all kinds of stuff, right? We load them up with, calling, the heavy callings and the obligation and the, not to mention just, they tend to be the ones with families that, lots of family obligations and lots of job obligations and then ward obligations and things like that. And so what we're left with then is when we try to think about, okay, well, how can we as a ward or how can we as families go out and serve the community? It's like the folks who might have the best capacity to do that are just completely tapped out, right? So how can we, we can't just say, well, the church has us covered because we've got the global humanitarian program or whatever, we're sending wheelchairs to Africa or, like that can't check the box for us in terms of being the salt of the earth. We've got to do it in our own communities and our own, wherever we live. So how do we tweak that? Because it seems like it's a struggle, right? It seems like going from the sort of Utah pioneer church, there is no world outside of the ward versus we're in the world now. And how do we turn our attention and efforts and actually do something more? How do we tweak that in terms of what we're doing so that we have greater capacity at the ward level, at the local levels to do what you're talking about?
Yeah, fantastic question. That is the $1 billion question right there. I think we have to do a little bit better job, and I think actually we're moving in this direction. I'm pretty optimistic along these lines. I grew up in a church and in a church culture where like it was all encompassing, and it, like my entire moral imagination, and part of it was geography, living in Utah and so forth, but like my entire moral imagination like was within the church, right? That was the limits of what I thought about. I mean, I knew there were other people out there, right? But like the world that mattered was the world on the inside. And I think that's changing for a lot of us. Now, it's absolutely true that for particular individuals with particular callings at particular times, like church service is gonna tap them out. It's gonna ask everything of them, and they're not gonna have, you know, between that and family and work, they're not gonna have a whole lot of time left over for others. But in any ward or congregation, that's a pretty small handful of people. That leaves a lot of talented people who do have time, you know, and gifts to go outside. And I think once our imagination expands, and once we say, okay, you know, and also the good thing is that most of our callings are short term, right? Even a bishop is 5 years, you know, a Relief Society president, 3 to 5 years. So even those heavy duty callings, even a stake president, only 9 or 10 years. For most of us, will get released, and there will be a time that then we can move on. So part of it is a time and season type thing. But I do think that we can just do a better job of expanding our imagination as a member of if I'm a member of the church that does not currently have one of those all-encompassing callings, where is God calling me? So I'll go and teach my primary lesson, right? And that'll take 1 hour on Sunday and maybe an hour or two of preparation during the week. Okay, but where else does God want my gifts this week, this month? And so I think just as we expand our notion of that, the other thing is, you know, sometimes, and I've fallen into the trap as well, of thinking that like the service outside is the service that really matters. That the service that we do in the ward is somehow like, oh, that's just like obligatory and so forth. And like somehow like the service to non-members of the church or community members is somehow more important or more elevated, more righteous than service within the church. And I've had to repent of that, because you know what, God loves people in the church too, right? And so that service that I give to a fellow ward member, I'm pretty sure God cares about that just as much as my service to a non-ward member. And those forms of service are real. And I think that's part of the reasons that God puts us in congregations, is to focus our attention, our time, our energies to the people who are right in front of us. Because again, it's easy for me to write a check for $100, you know, to earthquake victims in Syria and Turkey. That's really important, right? And I hope that $100 goes a long way to help people who are desperately in need. Okay, but God also puts people right in front of me through a ward. A ward becomes the means and the mechanism through which God puts people in front of me for me to serve, whether it be children, whether it be youth, whether it be families, other kinds of things. So I don't think it has to be an either or. I think it just has to be an all of the above. And I think we need to, and again, I think we're going in this direction to validate and to teach people to say, like, where is God calling you right now? To expand our notion of calling. The calling isn't just something that the bishop asks you to do, you know, within a quote unquote calling, but what is God calling you to do? Is God calling you, you know, to work with the homeless, to work in the local food kitchen, to be part of a global NGO, right? Where is God calling you? Not just where is the bishop calling you? And I think once we have that kind of all of the above approach, then I think we'll be of even more service to our sisters and brothers.
Patrick, thank you. I think that's a beautiful place to stop. I just have been so inspired by these comments and by your books. I really love this idea of each of us working in our little corner of the farm here, and contributing in our own way with our own gifts and talents. And I love that thought about, you know, what is God calling you to do, and whatever that is. Thank you so much for sharing these great thoughts and I don't know, helping us think about really concrete ways that we can go out and do better and be the salt and the yeast and the light. So thank you, Patrick. And
Thanks, Jenny.
yeah, and thank you everyone else for being here. Any final thoughts? No?
Join us for the next one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Look for some information on the next one coming up. And if I don't know, Patrick, if you want to stick around for a second and say anything else, you're welcome
Sure.
to. Otherwise, we'll see
Just
you all.
good to see you all.
Yeah.
Thanks all very much.
Thank you.